My name's Cashin. I was the chief between 2018 and the back end of 2022. I was quite young when I entered the fire service. I was 21, I'd done a number of other jobs, and I wanted to do something that felt like it meant something. I was very young. I think I thought it'd be very exciting, it'd be different, it'd be interesting, and it'd be challenging. And actually, on reflection, it was all of those things. So my career began in Greater Manchester Fire Service just under 35 years ago. And I was originally posted as a firefighter to Moss Side Fire Station in Manchester, which at the time was a very interesting place to work as a young firefighter. It was very busy, there were an awful lot of fires, there was a huge amount of social deprivation, a lot of drugs, a lot of gun crime. And as a young person working in the fire service, it was interesting, and there was a huge amount of opportunity to learn things. And I think in many ways it shaped me as well, because I saw huge amounts of incidents. A lot of times people had very little to lose, losing those few things that they did have, and an awful lot of deaths. And the reality is those things do start to shape the way that you think, and it ceased to be something that in many ways was exciting, challenging and interesting to something that was actually quite a dark thing. And I think that very much shaped my thinking for the future, and perhaps one of the reasons that I've had a strong leaning towards prevention throughout most of my career. I came over to Cheshire in 2006, I think, as a deputy chief, with responsibility in the organisation initially for prevention and protection, and over the years that was added to with things like service delivery, communications, finance, HR, and that role became significantly bigger over many, many years. And ultimately in 2018, I was very fortunate to be promoted to be chief of this amazing organisation. And as I say, I enjoyed being chief for nearly 5 years. It was a really interesting tenure as chief because it started initially at a time after great change, much of the change which I'd been involved in. And it was clear that the organisation needed to change in some different ways. And that's that. What was very clear to me at the beginning was that people didn't feel like they had a strong voice in the organisation. They felt that they couldn't bring about change. A lot of the work I did perhaps in the first couple of years as chief was about creating networks and confidence in people. It wasn't about improving the surveys, it was about making people feel that the organisation they worked for was one that they really wanted to work for and they felt safe and happy working for, but moreover that their view counted. There was also a separate issue within the organisation, and that's that we had traditional grey book roles and roles that were described as non-operational. Even that was a term that I wasn't fond of, because it created almost a bit of a them and the us, and almost as if one was superior to the other. And we saw, on many occasions, that actually one side couldn't operate without the other. They were hugely important. And it was really important to me that we recognised the breadth of skills across the organisation, and we did as much as we could to disrupt the idea that one tier was somehow more important than the other, because actually we were a single team. We very much wanted to be seen as a team and operate as a team. But moreover, people needed to feel like it was a team. They didn't want to feel like they were just non-operational. That was a term that I'd quite often hear that people describe themselves as just a firefighter. There's no such thing as just, in my view. People are fundamentally important parts of this organisation, everything that they do for it, because we wouldn't have the role if it wasn't fundamentally important. I was seen as a new chief, and I suppose there was always this fear of, okay, what's the latest gimmick going to be? I was very clear that we would take the recommendations of staff right the way to elected members, and if need be, we would invest in some of the recommendations and changes, and we would implement them. There were significantly big changes that took place as a result of recommendations from staff groups, and big investment. And I really do believe that some of those changes made massive differences to the organisation, but they also changed people's perception because we had tangible results. People could put a hand to stuff that had changed as a result of their recommendations. In many cases, recommendations that had probably stagnated for years that should have been picked up and done elsewhere. And it's the danger of making it sound like I'm being critical of the organisation. I'm not. This organisation delivered huge amounts, but it delivered it at pace, at massive pace. And sometimes when you do that, you miss stuff. And I think I was part of that, so we did miss stuff. But I very much think that the changes we put in place address that. Inclusivity has always been really important to me, and it's had to be something that was real, not something that we could put a badge on a wall or just say that we were an inclusive organisation. People had to really feel that it was. And my personal experience, that goes back over 20 years. I can remember in Greater Manchester taking fire engines for the first time to the Pride marches in Manchester, and it was, at the time, it was quite difficult. There'd been a number of firefighters suspended in Scotland for refusing to attend Pride marches, and it seems ridiculous now. That was the thinking at the time. And when I came to Cheshire, my first year in Cheshire, we took a number of vehicles to Manchester Pride because there wasn't a local one at the time. It was the nearest Pride. In the first instance, there was myself and probably half a dozen other people took some vehicles to Manchester. Over the years, that grew tenfold. It became a very important symbol to the organisation. And I think we were innovative. We had very good individuals in communications and other departments that looked at the things that we did to demonstrate our inclusivity. And we had pink and rainbow fire engines, which everybody has those now, but we were the first. At the time, we faced loads of criticism for this. I lost count of the number of letters I got from people saying they were angry taxpayers and that their money was being wasted. And they felt very deflated when I demonstrated to them that I'd got somebody to sponsor it and it hadn't actually cost us anything. And funnily enough, they were still upset that we were wrapping fire engines in either rainbow or pink colours to show that we would stand with our colleagues. And that was the important bit to me, is that we needed to be strong allies for our colleagues in this organisation. People needed to really believe it, that was the case. We created, obviously, forums. So we've got the Fire Pride Forum, which was very successful, and we started working with Stonewall a number of years ago. And we had massive gaps when we first started working as an organisation, policy gaps, training gaps. Actually, some of our facilities weren't as they should be. And Stonewall were really useful to us because they provided a benchmark to operate against. And obviously, we know we've got the Stonewall index. I think the first time we entered it, we were about 250 out of the hundreds of, if not thousands of organisations that enter it. And that could perhaps have been seen as a negative, and I didn't see it that way. I saw it as showing where we were and what we needed to do to change, and that the journey would be quite long in that change. And year by year, we changed both policy, facilities, practices, recruitment, and the way that we behaved, and the way that we operated. I mean, little things, that sound silly now, but senior folk wearing rainbow lanyards for a number of years, we faced huge criticism from lots of people for wearing those, and it became the norm, and our politicians started wearing them. And it was a visible demonstration that we stood with our LGBT colleagues every day. And actually, the culture in this organisation very much became one that it was intolerant of prejudice. And I was very proud of that fact that this organisation, people recognised that we were a part of a team, and it didn't matter what your sexual preferences were, that actually we were all in one team together and we should stand up for each other. And as you know, we became a real success story through Stonewall. We were, for many years, one of the highest public sector organisations. Then we broke into the top 10, we became the top fire service in the country. And I know when I left, I think we were the second in the country, the second 2 out of Stonewall 100, which is a remarkable achievement. But I think there's a bigger achievement, and that's that our staff surveys, when we broke them down, the happiest people in this organisation were our LGBT staff. That is not the norm in organisations. We had created a culture where our staff that were LGBT felt safe and protected, and that work was a good and safe place to come. Similarly, when we looked at our recruitment data, the number of people that applied that stated they were LGBT was a much, much higher percentage than other organisations. And what that says to me is not only did people feel safe within the organisation, but the word was out that this was a good place to work, a safe place to work, an inclusive place to work. And I think that's just the right thing. We always say that, this organisation does the right thing. That was always part of doing the right thing, is that everybody should be able to come to work, feel safe and feel included. And I think this organisation does that really well. So it's interesting that one of the things I'm very proud of is the creation of the new training centre as a modern fit-for-purpose training centre. And it was a significant financial investment as well. But it came from talking to new recruits. So I began my career 30 odd years ago at Moss Side, and I was going to, I think in my first week, I went to 4 or 5 fires because it was a very busy place. It was a place that had lots of incidents. And I got lots of experience from those. And I attended a couple of watch visits, doing some consultation, spotted some newer folk on the watch and just chatted to them about how they're finding it and what their experience. It was very positive, their experience of the service. And it's kind of quite a common question. You'd say, so what incidents have you been to? And they kind of looked at me and sort of shook their head and said, well, sorry, what do you mean? I said, well, how many house fires have you been to? And you've been in 6 months, so what's the most interesting house fire and what did you get from it? And somebody said, I've never been to a house fire. And they'd been working for 6 months, and this was quite a busy station at the time, and it kind of slightly took me aback. And I thought, well, it must just be a fluke. This individual's obviously very fortunate, and or unfortunate from an experience perspective, but fortunate that from a society perspective. But I started asking the question repeatedly to new firefighters. I was finding that virtually none of them had been to significant incidents. And I suppose we should have realised that. We'd driven the number of incidents down through prevention over the years. And I don't suppose we'd completely connected the dots as to what that was doing to experiential learning, particularly in younger and newer firefighters. But firefighters across the piece, is we'd lost one of the facets that we had. And I looked at the training centre that we had here at the time, and it was functional, but it was very pedestrian, and it was very similar to the training centre that I'd had 30 odd years ago. It hadn't changed, and yet we'd changed. And 30 odd years ago, it may have been fit for purpose because it gave the base skills that allowed you to go onto stations and then experience and develop those and refine those skills through lots of real incidents. And we had a gap because people weren't getting those real incidents. So it made me realise that we were carrying a massive risk, actually. I wanted a training centre that was more fit for purpose, that gave people a more realistic experience, and would fill that gap as much as it could that we'd created through driving incidents down. And at the time, money was very tight organisationally, and I spoke to our politicians, and we looked at our budgets, and it was a very bold move to decide we were going to spend, which at the time was over £10 million, I think it ended up being about 12 or 13 in the end, on a new training centre. But it was that important. It really was that important, because we say to firefighters, train as if your life depends on it, because it does. And actually, I don't think we were giving them the facility that actually allowed them to really do that. And what we did was we engaged with our staff, and our trainers in particular, to see what we could do to provide a different type of training, a different facility. And we toured the country, and actually other countries individuals went to look at how training was done elsewhere. And as a result of that, we distilled, I think, lots of the very best ideas into an amazing facility that's based at Winsford now. And the feedback we've had on it has been universally positive. At the same time, I think it wasn't just about having the right facility and the right experience. We needed the right culture. And to me, it was about making people feel safe to fail. People had to be able to come here to the training centre and make mistakes and learn from them, because if you made mistakes, certainly when I joined as a firefighter 30 odd years ago, if you made mistakes, you were just shouted at. You didn't learn an awful lot from that. All that happened is you feared making mistakes and you feared disclosing those mistakes. We wanted people to feel comfortable saying what they'd done wrong, because if I do something wrong, chances are somebody else could do something wrong and they can learn from my experience. And that was just as important as having the right facility. And I feel really proud as one of the ex-chiefs of this organisation that we've got a facility that's something of a legacy. It will train and keep firefighters and consequently our communities safe, I'm hoping, for generations to come. I think the pandemic feels a bit like a distant memory for people now, but it was a hugely important time for all of us, a very difficult time for all of us. And as chief, it was probably the toughest thing that I faced. In fact, it was the toughest thing I faced, there's no doubt about it. And in its first stages, I massively underestimated it. When news of the worldwide pandemic first started to be mooted, think I thought it would be a bit like swine flu and one or two of the other bits that we'd heard before, and was initially, I think, caught slightly off guard, and then realised just how big an issue this was going to be. And at the very beginning, there was a little bit of a pause almost while we decided what we would do. And my view was that we very much needed to do a few things very well. And the first of those was to keep our people safe. That was fundamental. We had to keep everybody in this organisation as safe as we possibly could. And we also needed to communicate with them as much as we could. No secrets. Explain everything that we know. And if we didn't know anything, tell them we didn't know anything, because I'd also seen there was a massive risk that things like social media and rogue news outlets could spread panic and disharmony in the organisation and society at the time. But the other thing we wanted to do was step up as an organisation, and that's do anything we could, and I mean anything, to support the wider good across our communities. And I think we did those things quite well in reflection. I can look back now and think that we achieved those. Keeping our people safe was easier said than done, because we were doing activity that involved people going frequently into people's homes. Incidents were exposed, and we had to change completely the way that our operational staff operated and completely the way that our fire staff operated. And we did it almost overnight. And anybody that delivers change will tell you change is a very difficult thing to deliver, and it needs very broad communication. It needs to be done generally over quite decent periods of time. We didn't have any of those facilities. And what was it like at the time? It was relentless for everybody. My world was relentless. I was in meetings 7 days a week, whether it be national government, whether it be regional meetings, whether it was chairing a daily meeting here, was delivering change and doing stuff. But everybody else's world was relentless as well. So I was no different to anyone else. And we were all facing this, what felt like a bit of unknown risk, but equally we were hearing rising numbers of deaths every day. And sooner or later, I think everybody in the service knew somebody that had probably died from COVID. And that had a very deep impact on all of us, I think, to some degree. That changing the way that we operated can't be underestimated, because we had legions of people from places like headquarters and stations that completely left their offices, in many cases for months on end, and overnight set up offices in their kitchens, their spare bedrooms, and kept this organisation going. Our prevention staff changed overnight from going into people's homes doing what they normally did to delivering food, helping with swabbing, vaccinations, which I'll come to in a moment. Our operational staff had to change. It's quite rigorous the way that they had to go about cleaning stuff, about kind of remaining very vigilant about not cross-contamination, not infecting each other, not being infected by the public. And we had lots of people that caught COVID during that time, but we didn't have too many mass outbreaks as a result of it. Whereas, there were other organisations that learned from our procedures that lost whole stations overnight because they didn't have the same cleaning procedures, the same cultural procedures that we had in place. And I think that very much view that we were all in it together as well. I said earlier that we did lots of stuff to protect the public. We did, temporary mortuaries. We don't talk about them, but they were very difficult jobs that people did at the time. And I got huge respect for the people that crewed those. We helped swab people. We took people to hospitals. We delivered food. We managed PPE, endless. And actually, we very much became the organisation that would say yes. And we wouldn't say, very importantly, we weren't saying yes and please give us a cheque. We were doing it just for the public good. We had a resource of people that could help, and we were very keen to do so. Clearly the biggest part, that was the vaccination programme. Brokered and managed in the first instance by a number of people in this organisation that did an amazing job of getting it off the ground. And then a legion of volunteers from right across the organisation, from admin roles to operational roles, to people that worked in technical services, to people that worked in protection, prevention, literally right across this organisation. I think it's a massive legacy. We gave over 100,000 vaccinations to the people of Cheshire. I talked to the staff that did some of those early vaccinations about how they felt, and they had people that had been locked down for months, older people that had not been out, because a lot of them, remember, had been given stay-at-home orders before the official lockdowns, who were weeping because they were being given, in their mind, their freedom back. And there was still this view that they could die. They very much felt that this was being protected. And it was our staff that did that. I'm hugely proud of them. And quite often, there were staff that really couldn't bring themselves to do vaccinations, but they backfilled the staff that did. Everybody was in this together. And that being in it together, I saw countless examples of staff stepping up to help each other. And it was really humbling, really, really humbling. And there's a danger of me getting emotional talking about it, actually. I think it was a really important time for this organisation, and one I'm hugely proud to have been part of as the chief. I think the thing that, to me, that's always felt special about Cheshire Fire and Rescue Service is it's had a culture where it always wants to punch above its weight. It always wants to do more, and it wants to do as much as it can to be the best, whether it be operationally, be the best, whether it be prevention, protection, or anything that we do. And it's not just wanting to be the best so it can say it's the best, it's so that it provides the best service to those that work within it and also to its communities. And there's countless examples, whether that be this service starting the British Trust many years ago, whether it be the home safety visits that we did over many years, the shift to prevention, the creation of the new training centre. And there are countless examples. The one that I'm probably proudest of is the work that we did around the smoke alarm campaign. Because despite all the hard work that we were doing, getting into tens of thousands of homes every year, there was still a pattern of people that were dying in fires, and invariably they lived in rented accommodation. And we felt there was something we could do about it. We felt that if we legislated as a country, that many lives would be saved up and down the country, because we knew at the time, I think you were about 8 times more likely to die in a fire if you were in a rented house than in a house that was owned. And we wanted to do something about it. And I think we're a medium-sized service. We decided unilaterally we would lead a campaign to try and change the law. And I say that now, and it sounds almost fanciful that we would try to do that as an organisation. And we set a long-term target of 2 parliaments to change the law. And we had a small team of people here and a number of great supporters, what was the Chief Fire Officers Association at the time, now the National Fire Chiefs Council, in their comms team. And we started a political campaign working with national politicians, and we had a number of strong advocates, working with local politicians, and again we had strong advocates, working with large residential landlord organisations, and repeatedly turning up to Parliament to lobby and engage with people to try and drive this change. And at the time, government had made it very clear that they were on a deregulatory trajectory. In fact, the Minister at the time, Eric Pickles, had said that from a regulation perspective, it was 2 out, 1 in. For every new piece of regulation, there needed to be 2 that fell away. So it was almost an impossible task to change those mindsets, and yet we did. We did change those mindsets. And we had a campaign that was called A Small Change to Save Lives. And I think the secret of it, and I come back to what's so special about Cheshire, is the organisation was relentless. The people in this organisation were relentless. They just kept pushing and pushing, and I was really pleased to be part of that group of people. And ultimately, we did get the change. 2015, which was actually 2 years, not 2 parliaments, after we started the campaign, we got a change in the law for both smoke alarms and carbon monoxide. And the government's own impact assessment at the time estimated that it would be probably just under 30 lives a year that would be saved nationally, every year. And that wasn't just in Cheshire, that was right across the country. And I think that says something about Cheshire, that we led a campaign to save not just lives here, but everywhere. And the legacy of that is lives will be saved for years and years to come as a result of the work that was led by Cheshire. And as well as introducing the legislation, they also gave us nationally a couple of £1 million to soften the blow on landlords to spend on smoke alarms. So we had a massive injection of extra smoke alarms into the system. So not only did we get the primary legislation, but we also got a huge amount of extra prevention work that was injected very quickly into our communities. So that's just one of countless examples of why I look at Cheshire as an amazing organisation.